For many of us, preserving the bounty of the garden is one of the great joys of having a garden in the first place. In the dead of winter, you can pull out the things that you've grown, that you've produced, and have a wonderful meal. There are problems in this from time to time, however, when you find that you've got a few carrots, a few green beans, a few something else, and not enough of any one thing to actually make a canner load, and it's a lot of work to go through it if the canner's not full. So one of the alternatives for that, the choices you have, is to make mixed vegetables. Now, in order to do this, it's best to get a canning guide and follow the procedures that are in there. There are specific directions for canning mixed vegetables. If you start with carrots, for instance, they may have a shorter processing time than green beans, or vice versa. You throw in corn and the whole thing becomes a bit of a confusion as to exactly how long you have to process. Mixed vegetables are a good alternative for winter meals. They make a good choice for soup. And if you have an idea of what you want to do with them in the dead of winter, you know which vegetables you want to mix and how you want to blend them. We are going to use the canning guide that is available through the USDA today and mix together the vegetables that are prescribed with a few exceptions. Now, in general, it gives some proportions, and it's good if you can follow those with a rule of thumb. This is not like pickles where you have to follow precisely, so that if you want to make some variations in which vegetables you're adding and how many you're adding and which kinds you're adding, that's fine. We're going to use carrots today, and I'm using half of the recipe in the guide for what we're doing today. So we have 3 cups of carrots. We're also going to add 3 cups of corn. Now, my garden, and I think most gardens in Oklahoma, don't have everything get ripe at the same time that you might want to put in here. So you can do what I've done today, is we're using some fresh vegetables, and we're mixing those with some canned vegetables, or some frozen vegetables, excuse me. Canned vegetables would also work, however, they will give you a little bit lower quality because they've already been processed once along the way for a fairly long length of time. So corn, which usually is later in the year than green beans, for instance, we're going to go ahead and use some frozen and some fresh. Now, the canning guide calls for lima beans, and my family is one where no matter how many times I encourage them to eat lima beans, and someday they will eat them, at this point in their lives, I still find little piles of lima beans. So instead of that, I'm going to add something that I know they will eat, which is green beans. And we are going to add 3 cups of green beans. We're going to add 3 cups of peas. Now, you could use almost any vegetable with this, with the exception, there are a few exceptions. You would not want to use fresh greens because of the way they basically melt down when they're heated. You also would not want to use potatoes because they disintegrate. You wouldn't want to use winter squash because of the way it slows the flow of water throughout the jar, or liquid throughout the jar. We simply are going to blend these together. And this one, for me, is going to be used for soup later on. So what I'm going to do is add tomatoes to this that are crushed. You could add whole tomatoes, you could add quartered tomatoes. Again, that's up to your preference. But we're going to go ahead and add these to this. And if you don't have quite 2 cups, which is what this calls for, as well as 2 cups of zucchini in this instance, you could add a little bit of tomato juice to it. You could cover it with tomato juice. The recipe calls for covering it with water. Now, one of the things you'll notice about this mix is that most of the things in here call for pressure canning. The only exception would be tomatoes. They can be water bath canned. And in some instances, we do have recipes for mixed vegetables with tomatoes that do go in a water bath canner. If that's what you're doing, you need to be very, very careful to follow the proportions, because there you're not going to be processing it at as high a temperature and as long of a period of time as they're going to be processing in a pressure canner. Because we can vary the ingredients here, you could have substituted some onions, for instance. You could have substituted most any other vegetable you would like. We have a very long processing time. This is going to be processed for 75 minutes in a pressure canner in pint jars and 90 minutes for quart jars, and that will take care of any mix of vegetables you have, with those few exceptions that I told you that we don't mix in with these. At this point, we cover it with boiling water or very hot water, and that's simply to slow the heating process down a little bit. You could use cold water, but it's going to take you longer to get it to the right level. Just enough to cover the vegetables. We then cover the pot and put it over the heat and bring it to a boil and let it boil for 5 minutes. Once it's boiled for 5 minutes, you're ready to fill the jars. If you choose, you can add a teaspoon of salt to every quart jar, a half a teaspoon to every pint. Fill them up to the 1-inch mark with solids and then cover that with liquid also to the 1-inch mark. You're then ready to put on the flats and seal them with the lids. Now the processing time will be 75 minutes. The amount of pressure you need will depend on your altitude, so you will need to check either a state map or some other method to find out exactly how high you are. You may need to can it as many as 13 pounds pressure or as low as 10, depending on what kind of pressure canner you're using and what your altitude is. This makes a real good winter dish. I hope you'll try it. It works really well to extend some of those small amounts of vegetables that you have in the garden towards the end of the season. For Oklahoma Gardening, this is Barbara Brown.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.